Yeah, thank you very much to all the co-authors kind of congregating around this general area. I would have their names in the slides and all their affiliations, but it would eat up about 3 minutes of the paper talk. So you can find it all in the paper, but it was a great collaborative effort between researchers in Dublin, in Cork, and in Toronto. So thank you all very much, including Justin Edwards, who's the SV right there. Thank you, sir. So this paper is, again, a qualitative piece on what makes a good conversation, looking at challenges in designing truly conversational agents. Now, when I talk about conversational agents, I'm talking about these speech-based agents that have become quite prevalent in the past 4 or 5 years, thankfully, in particular, to the advent of intelligent personal assistants. So these include Amazon Alexa, Apple's Siri, Google Assistant, which you might find in home-based speakers, like on this picture here with the Apple HomePod, the Amazon Echo Dot, and the Google Home. A recent survey in the US found that 66.4 million people had access to some sort of smart speaker in home, a 40% growth from last year alone. So these speech-based conversational agents are definitely a very hot topic at the moment, as well as home-based speakers. They appear in our phones, our watches, our cars through things like Apple CarPlay, Amazon Echo Auto, and Android Auto, and even delightfully through our microwaves. So within a couple of years, we might have a voice-controlled kitchen, who knows? But despite the increasing prevalence of these speech-based conversational agents, we don't know necessarily what people want in terms of their conversational capabilities. In terms of trying to imbue them with conversational capabilities, we often look at importing certain linguistic strategies from human conversation, certain rules. I know someone was talking about repair earlier. We will imbue assistants with these, but we don't necessarily know what people might expect and people might want from these speech-based assistants. In terms of human-human conversation, it's often categorized into social and transactional talk. So social will be in terms of developing relationships, building and maintaining rapport, whereas transactional interactions will be focused on getting stuff done. These are the kind of two broad categories, but often they will end up overlapping. Social aspects of interaction have been explored for decades now in chatbots, in social robotics, using linguistic strategies like small talk or politeness in order to generate further rapport or generate further user engagement. But again, this is often mapping certain rules or strategies from human-human conversation onto human-agent conversation. So this paper, we looked at understanding the kind of innate differences between human agent and human-human conversation. What do people think makes a good conversation when they're interacting with people, and how do they think these characteristics should manifest when interacting with these speech-based conversational agents? So to do this, we ran 17 participants through semi-structured interviews. We had 9 male participants and 8 female participants. And throughout the interviews, lasting about 40 minutes to an hour, we covered 4 main topics. So to begin with, discussing the important characteristics of conversation with people. What do they think the purposes are for conversation? What do they think the important attributes are when talking with other people? We've moved on to their general attitudes towards conversation with agents. So what do they think about the concept in of itself? And then reflecting upon the attributes they brought up initially during the first topic and seeing how these human attributes might reflect in human-agent conversation. We then follow this up with talking about possible appropriate scenarios for conversations with agents. So I'll quickly talk about the conversations with people in terms of the important attributes, as a lot of this reflects what's been in literature from the 60s with conversation analysis through Emmanuel Shegloff, Gail Jefferson, Harvey Sachs, etc. Again, people would differentiate between these social and transactional purposes, either developing and maintaining interpersonal relationships or getting stuff done. Again, reflecting the literature from the past few decades. In terms of what makes a good conversation with people, this was split into 4 key attributes. The first being mutual understanding and common ground. So people stress the importance of understanding the intent and meaning behind their partner's utterances and having a knowledge of what that other person is like in terms of personality in order to contextualize their utterances. And this could be achieved through questioning through one another with maybe casual acquaintances and strangers. This could be accomplished through small talk, brief encounters with one another lasting from a couple of seconds to a couple of minutes. The second theme that came out was that of trustworthiness. This was seen as a key foundation for growing common ground and building relationships and being a gateway for more personal discussions. Active listening was described as people willing to engage in conversation, even if they have to listen for extended periods of time while their partner takes a lot of the talk, and showing a willingness to engage. And finally, humour was seen to scaffold conversation, add substance to it, and be a driver in of itself. It was also able to be used for softening more serious content. When contrasting this with how these attributes might manifest in conversations with agents, these were discussed and conceptualized in often markedly different ways. And I'll use several quotes from the interviews in order to exemplify these points. First of all, while human-human conversation was described as being broadly social and or transactional, the conversations with agents were discussed in terms of almost exclusively transactional and functional terms. One quote here: because it's a machine, you can't make a social connection with it. People might assume there's some sort of fundamental limit to interactions with machines through speech, and they see it often in very utilitarian and tool-based attitudes. They see maybe there's some sort of impossible or at least high-ceiling barrier to actually achieving the same interpersonal and social interactions they have with people in agent conversation. Other participants identified that there might need to be new paradigms in terms of conversation, saying there have to be new parameters as to what a conversation is with a machine. It might not be an appropriate metaphor to call human-agent interaction conversation, or it might not be an appropriate analogy to say conversation with agents is the same as it is with people. In terms of mutual understanding and common ground, these were conceptualized again in very different ways, in terms of it being one-way understanding and personalization on the part of the agent rather than the user. So one quote here almost perhaps misunderstood somewhat the point of common ground in being mutual understanding, saying, I'd be quite upset if I thought I had common ground with a computer, saying it's something that kind of creates a sense of uneasiness or unpleasantness, thinking they have something in common with a machine. Another quote mentioned, the more you interact with agents, the more they learn about, so the more personalized it becomes, looking at the personalization aspect, as well as the one-way understanding and common ground. A lot of talks already have talked about maybe adaptation in terms of system to the user or user to the system. In our interviews, people saw that as a very agent-focused task. In terms of trustworthiness, rather than it being discussed in terms of emotional trust, it was discussed often in terms of privacy, security, and transparency. So someone mentioned here, which is quite exemplary of what a lot of people talked about, how is that information being used in terms of their speech-based data with conversational agents? How are you using my data, and who has access to it? There have been enough stories about data breaches going on with non-speech data, and a lot of interesting and slightly terrifying news stories in terms of Amazon Alexa devices and who owns the data and who will be able to have access to it. So people were quite worried and dubious as to who has ownership of this data. Active listening became accurate listening, so people hate having to repeat themselves. Someone said it's not better in your experience if you have to sit and repeatedly ask. This is usually a technical problem, And people will be more forgiving to other people if they have to repeat themselves. Repair, as someone mentioned, being kind of an integral part of conversation. But when it comes with machines, people get frustrated very easily. So they would rather a machine understands their utterances at the first attempt. Finally, humour was seen as more of a gimmick, more of a novelty aspect in terms of interaction, rather than it being a scaffold for conversation and maybe a purpose in itself. Some participants said it might make the interaction more interesting and more engaging and might make them more likely to interact with the system again, whereas other people said it's not actually funny the way an organic conversation would be between two humans. So it's not maybe steeped in common ground and a rich shared history and experience, and not kind of based around maybe in-jokes. So a kind of very different, again, conceptualization of what humour would be in human-agent conversation. In all, the human-agent conversation was seen as something more tour-like, something more transactional, and something as to having this kind of master-slave relationship between user and system in comparison to their conversations with other people. The closest similarity would be, in terms of human-human conversation, would be conversations with casual acquaintances or strangers, often in what's called front desk encounters, where it's very limited greetings, maybe some provision of services, followed by some form of closing. One person exemplified this by saying, "I don't know why I'd want my tool to be vulnerable or be intimate." I know, again, there's a lot of talk today about social robotics or social agents, but when it comes to speech-based agents, there's a bit of an undecidedness here, perhaps owing to both the language that it might use, as well as the voice it might use to deliver this language. One of the great phrases someone used is unnormal. They just found this particular interaction very strange, very unnerving, very dissimilar to what they're used to. So there may be a familiarity problem, and there may need to be further longitudinal studies. In terms of longer-term use, people saw it as requiring significant time and effort, and they questioned the fundamental need to have any interpersonal relationships with agents through conversation. So one person said, on the one hand, you're sort of becoming a friend, but on the other, you can order it to do what you want. Again, highlighting this master-slave relationship. It's like, we can have a social interaction, but you must obey every command I give you, which is thankfully very rare in human-human interaction. Where it might be useful is contexts like healthcare, perhaps mental health, like which has been discussed in the chatbot talks earlier, perhaps isolated communities such as the elderly or people suffering from loneliness. But in all, this fundamental limit seems to be a barrier to having human-agent conversation mirror certain aspects of human-human conversation. This might be current perceptions as barriers due to speech interfaces being quite poor dialogue partners. Dialogue will often break down quite easily, and instead of it being conversation, as such, it's more isolated question-answer pairs. There's also the difficulty in trying to conceptualize technology that doesn't already exist. So things like art and films and narratives and design fiction might be an alternative method of encouraging people to think of this type of technology. And in all, there may be a need to reframe what is defined as human-agent conversation. It might be its own genre of conversation with different norms, different expectations, and this might differ depending on the context in which it's being used. In terms of looking forward, we'd have to look at longer sequential interactions rather than these isolated question and answer pairs, and maybe look at less tech-familiar participants and seeing how they respond to the idea of human-agent conversation and how they might respond to different and new stimuli. To kind of summarize 4 key points, it would be that conversations with people are highly social and highly transactional. These two things often overlap. Conversations with agents, however, are highly functional and tour-like. Social agent relationships through conversation was fundamentally questioned. There may be a fundamental limit as to what we can talk to machines about. And the paradigm of agent conversation may need to be redefined and reframed in terms of its own genre of a conversation and interaction. Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Leigh. Any questions from the audience? There's an interesting statement in your paper saying that the participants could not overcome the functional purposes of human agent conversation and were resistant to the idea of becoming friends with something inherently machine-like. And so remembering back what Alexa said about the robot that killed itself and was dying, I was wondering, is that just participants a lack of imagination or examples that they have that they think?
It could again be that kind of difficulty in imagining technology that doesn't necessarily exist. So maybe having this kind of stimuli either through prototypes like that, maybe Wizard of Oz experiments, any kind of simulation. If you can encourage people to think about it more, maybe they would actually reconsider their own opinions. There's an interesting couple of studies we did that kind of highlight this in a few different ways. In one paper, people were convinced that they wouldn't interact with a conversational agent through speech as they would with another person, saying, it's kind of weird. I don't want to be kind of chummy with a machine. Yet, when they were put into a situation where a conversational agent was highly conversational, they would use turn-taking, repair, politeness, vague language. They would use all these things that they would use with other people. So again, it might be a case of lack of imagination for one word, or lack of being able to think beyond their current perceptions, I think.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering what you mean by a change in paradigm, because I also see it in my own work. You are extending like the Casa paradigm in that we may treat machines socially, but how do we go beyond that? It's something that I'm just wondering myself. So what kind of relationships are people actually looking for beyond, we can say hello to it just like we say hello to a human?
Yeah, I mean, they may look for something that's more personalized to their own behavior, their own preferences, whether this is done user-led through perhaps certain settings or options that they might choose, or whether a system adapts itself to the user depending on maybe the user's emotional state, or somehow monitoring their preferences, or maybe arousal like during interaction. That was brought up quite a lot in terms of the personalization, sort of like mutual understanding and common ground. The kind of more friendship side of things, or more social, was either pushed onto healthcare or kind of scarily pushed onto, we'll give it to old people and they'll like it. That seems to be a common thing in the interviews. Somewhat dystopian, I think. But again, it probably leads down this road of lack of familiarity and maybe a lack of existing technology, I think.
I guess another attributes of human conversation we didn't touch is we do recipient design or audience design. We adapt in many different levels, right? You did mention like personalization for the kind of content grounding. But I wonder, in your interview, did you see other kinds of comments on adaptation, or what is the kind of expectation, level of adaptation people have for agent?
Justin, could you paraphrase that question for me?
Aside from personalizing for content, are there other forms of personalization that you might have found in your interviews, like personalizing in style or something like that?
In terms of personalization, I think voice would come up a couple of times. So people might want a particular type of voice that matches their own, for example. Accent being quite a huge marker of identity and can help with rapport and relationships. People often refer to their own accent as being quite preferable. There's also this idea of maybe using more human-like voices, because people expect more of human-like voices in terms of conversational capability, whereas synthetic voices are often seen as poorer dialogue partners. That would be, I suppose, the main thing that also came out of the interviews.
James Simpson, University of York. Very interesting study. One of the things I think you mentioned in terms of findings was that people tended to view these conversational agents as being sort of being used for very functional means. Whereas I know in previous research, I think like Clifford Nass, for instance, found that people were able to perceive personality coming out from text-to-speech systems. So I'm wondering sort of how do you sort of reconcile these two views where, users were able to perceive, I guess, human-like elements like personality from, say, things like text-to-speech systems, but I guess in your interviews they see it as more of a machine type of relationship.
They definitely talk a lot about this kind of master-slave relationship. I don't think personality necessarily means social. I'd say you can still accomplish all these very transactional tasks with, for example, expressive speech synthesis, so something that kind of generates some form of emotion. Maybe they ascribe certain personalities to them, but they would still see them as tools. So I think they can align these two concepts, and I don't think they're kind of mutually exclusive.
Hi, apologies if I missed it. Did you say if the people had any experience with any particular voice agent before doing those interviews?
Could you say that again, sorry?
I'm sorry, did you say if people had any experience with any particular agent? Are they Amazon Echo users?
Yes, that was probably one of the main limitations of the study, is that almost all the participants had either some knowledge or some experience in terms of interacting with this type of system. So maybe people who are less familiar with the technology, and indeed maybe more familiar with the technology in terms of like longitudinal experiences, might have different opinions as to what human-agent conversation should and maybe can be. That would be definitely something worth exploring in future work, I think.
Another round of applause for Leigh Clark and his troop of 12 co-authors, best author, which concludes the session. Thank you, everyone.